Hello everyone, welcome back to SAT Reading. My name is Min and I'll walk through the second passage of the 10th practice test on the College Board website. So let's get started with reading the passage. So, this passage is adapted from David Owen, The Conundrum, how scientific innovation, increased efficiency, and good intentions can make our energy and climate problems worse. Building good transit isn't a bad idea, but it can actually backfire if new trains and buses merely clear space on highway lanes for those who would prefer to drive, a group that historically has included almost everyone with access to a car. To have environmental value, new transit has to replace and eliminate driving on a scale sufficient to cut energy consumption overall. That means that a new transit system has to be backed up by something that imposes complementary reductions in car use, say the physical elimination of traffic lanes or the conversion of existing roadways into bikes or bus lanes, ideally in combination with higher fuel taxes, parking fees, and tolls. Needless to say, those ideas are not popular, but they are necessary because you can't make people drive less in the long run by taking steps that makes driving more pleasant, economical, and productive. One of the few forces with a proven ability to slow the growth of suburban sprawl has been the ultimately finite tolerance of commuters for long, annoying commutes. That tolerances have grown in recent decades, and not just in the United States, but it isn't unlimited. And even people who don't seem to mind spending half their day in a car eventually reach a point where enough is enough. That means that traffic congestions can have environmental value since it lengthens commuting times, and by doing so discourages the proliferation of still more energy-hungry subdivisions unless we made the congestions go away. If, in a misguided effort to do something of environmental value, municipalities take steps that makes long-distance car commuting faster or convenient by adding lanes, building bypasses, employing traffic control measures that make it possible for existing roads to accommodate more cars with fewer delays, replacing toll booths with radio-based systems that don't require drivers enough to slow down, we actually make the sprawl problem worse by indirectly encouraging people to live still farther from the job, stores, schools, and doctors' offices, and by forcing municipalities to further extend road networks, power grids, water lines, and other civic infrastructure. If you can cut commuting time by 10%, people who now drive 50 miles each way to work can justify moving 5 miles further out because their travel time won't change. This is how metropolitan area metasizes. It's the history of suburban expansion. Traffic congestion isn't an environmental problem, traffic is. Relieving congestions without doing anything to reduce the total volume of cars can only make the real problem worse. Highway engineers have known for a long time that building new car lanes reduces congestion only temporarily, because the new lanes foster additional driving, a phenomenon called induced traffic. Widening roads makes traffic move easier in the short term, but the improved condition eventually attracts additional drivers and entices current drivers to drive more, and congestion reappears. But with more cars, and that gets people thinking about widening roads again. Moving drivers out of the cars and into other forms of transportation can have the same effect. If existing traffic lanes are kept in service, roadway begets road use. One of the arguments that cities inevitably make in promoting transit plans is the new system. By relieving automobile congestion will improve the lives of those who continue to drive. No one ever promotes a transit scheme by arguing that it would make traveling less convenient, even though, from an environmental perspective, inconvenient travel is a worthy goal. And here are the figures. Effect of route capacity reduction in select regions. And figure 2 is a survey of transportation engineers' predictions of driver behavior. Alright, so now let's move on to the questions of the passage. So, the main purpose of the passage is to A. Provide support for the claim that efforts to reduce traffic actually increase traffic. Okay, so A does not actually talk about the main idea of the passage, as the main idea of the passage is how negative environmental consequences is associated with the increase in the agreeability of driving laws. So, as driving gets easier, there are more negative environmental consequences. So that's what the author is trying to tell us. So, A is incorrect. So let's cross that out. B. Dispute the widely held belief that building and improving mass transit systems is good for the environment. Okay, so this is also not focusing on the main purpose of the passage, as I said. So let's eliminate this. Discuss the negative environmental consequences of car-focused development and suburban sprawl. Well, the passage is not discussing the negative environmental consequences, but we are discussing the policy of negative environments. So C isn't the answer. So this leaves with D. Argue that one way to reduce the negative environmental effects of traffic is to make driving less agreeable. Right, so yes, the passage is arguing that if you can increase traffic congestion, people will drive less, leading to a positive change in the environment. So the word argue just shows that this is the correct answer. So for 11 it is D. 12. Which choice best supports the idea that the author assumes that all things being equal, people would rather drive than take mass transit? A lines 1 to 5, building car lines 5 to 8, 15 to 18, 19 to 22. Alright, so now let's go to the first paragraph and let's see what the author states. Building good transit isn't a bad idea, but it can actually backfire if the new trains and buses merely clear space on highway lanes for those who would prefer driving, a group that historically has included almost everyone with access to a car. So, we can say in this sentence the author is attempting to base his claim about the unintended consequences of building public transit on the expression that most people would definitely prefer driving instead of taking public transit. Hence, this sentence supports the idea that the author is assuming that people would rather drive rather than taking public transit. So therefore, A should be the correct answer. Alright, as used in 9.9, backed up most nearly means A is supported, B copied, C substituted, and D jammed. Alright, so let's go back to line 9. So let's actually start from line 8. That means that a new transit system has to be backed up by something that impels complementary reductions in car use. Alright, so this can be simplified to be said that new public transportation initiatives needs to be supported by policies that act on the car use rate. So therefore, backup most can be substituted by the word supported. So if you go back, supported is A, and supported is the only appropriate answer to this question, because copied, substituted, and jammed results in miscommunication. Alright, in the first paragraph, the author concedes that his recommendations are A, costly to implement, B, not widely supported, C, strongly opposed by experts, D, environmentally harmful in the short term. Alright, so we have been talking a lot about the first paragraph, and we can sum it up that in the first paragraph, the author is trying to attempt to introduce proposals for reducing car traffic by making driving less convenient. However, in the first paragraph, you can also see that these ideas of making driving less inconvenient is very unpopular to the audience to the general public. So therefore, we can conclude that the author concedes that his recommendations aren't widely supported. So basically, the answer to this question is B. And there are no evidence that the author states that his recommendations are A, costly to implement, C, strongly opposed by experts, and D, environmentally harmful in the short term, because the author states that his recommendations are actually environmentally harmful, but also in the long term. So it's not based on the short term. So the answer to 14 is B. Based on the passage, how would the author most likely characterize many attempts to improve traffic? A. They are doomed to fail because most people like driving too much to change their habits. B. They overestimate how tolerant people are of long commutes. C. They are well-intentioned but ultimately lead to the environmental harm. D. They will only work if they are making driving more economical and productive. Alright, so let's go back into the passage. Let's say that second paragraph. Alright, so let's start from here. If in a misguided effort to do something of an environmental value, municipalities take steps that make long-distance car commuting faster or more convenient by adding lanes, building bypasses, employing traffic control measures that make it possible for existing roads to accommodate more cars with fewer delays, replacing toolbox with radio-based systems that don't require drivers even to slow down. We're actually making the small problem worse by indirectly encouraging people to live further from the job stores, schools, and doctors' offices, and by forcing municipalities to further extend road networks, power grids, water lines, and other civic infrastructure. Alright, so this is basically saying that the measures that make driving more convenient is actually harming the environment because they're actually encouraging people to live in more developed places. For example, like let's say New York City, so which represents wasteful expansion in the author's view. So therefore, if you go back here, the correct answer to this should be C, because they are well-intentioned but ultimately leads to environmental harm. Yep. 16. Which choice provides the best evidence to answer the previous question? A. Lines 8 to 14, 22 to 26, 31 to 40, 64 to 67. Okay, so because the previous question asked us how the author would most likely characterize many attempts to improve traffic, the answer that the author would most likely characterize such attempts as well intentions but ultimately leads to environmental harm is best supported in the second paragraph. So since the evidence should be in the second paragraph, A and D we can remove. And let's go back to the second paragraph and let's see line 22 to 26, which is B, choice B. Okay, so that tolerance has grown in recent decades, and not just in the United States, but it isn't unlimited, and even people who don't seem to mind spending half their day in the car eventually reach a point where finally enough is enough. Alright, so we can see that this isn't talking about how attempts to improve traffic are well-intentioned but leads to environmental harm. So the only correct answer would be C by process of elimination, but let's check C as well. So C is 31 to 40. If in a misguided effort to do something of environmental value, yeah, this is the one that we read, so C is ultimately the correct answer here. Yep. So the answer is C. Alright, now let's go to 17. According to the passage, reducing commuting time for drivers can have which of the following effects? A. Drivers become more productive employees than they previously were. B. Mass transit get extended further into the suburban areas than it previously was. C. Mass transit carries fewer passengers and receives less government funding than it did previously before. D. Drivers become more willing to live further from their place of employment than they previously were. Alright, so if you paid attention, you would know that D is present on the second paragraph. So yeah, this is because the second paragraph discusses how efforts to making commuting more convenient can also have unintended consequences of encouraging people to live farther away from their jobs. Right, so let's try and find evidence for this. I think I saw it in like line 40, so line 45. If you can cut commuting time by 10%, people who now drive 50 miles each way to work can justify moving 5 miles further out because their travel time won't change. This is how the metropolitan areas metasize. Yeah, basically this is telling us that reducing commuting time for drivers can have the effect of making drivers more willing to live further away from their places of employment, which is basically what answer D is, right? So the answer to this question would be D. Alright, let's go to 18. As used in line 72, promotes most familiar means of A, upgrades, B, serves, C, advocates, D, develops. Okay, now let's go back to line 72 and read from there. No one ever promotes a transit scheme by arguing that it would make traveling less convenient. Alright, so this is actually telling us that nobody advocates or pushes for changes to the transportation system by arguing that they would make traveling less convenient. So thus promoting, as used in the passage, can mostly mean advocate. So the answer should be C. Yep. Alright, let's move on to 19. According to figure 1, how many vehicles traveled on the altered road through the Southampton city center per day before the route was altered? A, 3,081, B, 5,316, C, 24,101, D, and finally D, 26,522. Alright. Now let's take a look at figure 1. Alright, so we can see that figure 1 presents us like data that's related to the effect of route capacity reduction on selected regions. And in the road that's pertaining to the Southampton city center, the number 5,316 appears, as you can see here, before alteration. So the correct answer should be B, as the number of vehicles that traveled on the altered road through Southampton city center per day before the route was altered is 5,316, as shown in the statistical table right here. So 19's answer is B. These sorts of figure questions, table questions, you have to like focus really on the details of the figure. So make sure you guys focus on what the figure is telling us and if the correct data is seen there. Alright, so let's move on to the last two questions of this passage. Do the data in figure 1 support or weaken the argument of the author of the passage, and why? Alright, so we can recall back to chapter 1 where the author argues that to have environmental value, a new transit system must be backed up by something that imposes complementary reductions in car use, such as like the physical elimination of traffic lanes, for example. And let's go back to figure 1, let's see what it says. And yeah, so according to figure 1, it also shows that the reducing route capacity results in a net reduction in regional traffic in all 5 areas studied, which is Ratchablood, Southampton, Tower Bridge, London, New York Highway, and Kinyard Bridge, Edmonton. Yep, and therefore the data supports the argument of the author, so we can cross out C and D. And as it shows that reducing road capacity can lead to a net reduction in traffic, the answer should be B. Alright, now we're on to the last question of the passage. Based on the figure 2, the engineers surveyed were most skeptical of the idea that in the event of reallocation of road space, drivers would A, change when they travel, B, change their means of travel, C, how often they make a journey, and D, their driving style. Alright, so let's scroll back to figure 2. Alright, so figure 2 presents us with like data that's related to an opinion poll of transportation engineers, as it states here. And according to the y-axis table, we can see that the engineers were asked whether a significant road space reallocation could result in people changing various aspects of their driving. And the graph shows us 4 different answer possibilities, which is here, which is in different colors. First of all, it's yes. Second is yes in exceptional circumstances. Third one is no. And the fourth one is don't know. And the question asks for the aspect of driver behavior that the engineers surveyed thought was least likely to change in the event of a reallocation of a road space. So according to figure 2, it shows that when they travel, their means of traveling, how often they make a journey, or the driving style. So of these 4 choices, their driving style received the smallest percentages of yes and yes in exceptional circumstances in response to the larger percentages of no and no responses. No and don't know responses. So based on figure 2, we can say that the engineers surveyed were most skeptical in the idea in the event of a reallocation of a road space that the drivers would change their driving style. So the answer to the 21st question would be the driving style. Right? Thank you so much for listening and watching our SAT reading passage video, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Also, please note that other SAT reading videos will be coming out soon next week, so I'll see you then. Thank you for listening, and bye.